I was ironing my father's shirt for his retirement dinner when my sister said it, loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear, over the sound of the oven timer going off. "It's easy to look successful when your husband signs the checks." Everyone laughed. The easy laugh of people who've said the same joke so many times it stopped sounding like an insult to them, even though it never stopped sounding like one to me. I didn't put the iron down hard. I didn't say a word back. I just set court-ordered valuation because for 11 years my family had told me I would be nothing without Derek's money, and I was about to find out, with total legal precision, exactly how much of that money had been mine all along. My name is Naomi Hart. I went back to my maiden name the day the divorce was finalized, but at the time of this story, I was still Naomi Calloway. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a certified business valuation appraiser, which means companies hire me to determine what a business is actually worth, down to the equipment, the goodwill, the client contracts, the intellectual property nobody thinks to price correctly. I spend my professional life proving that value isn't always where people assume it is, that the person whose name is on the sign out front isn't always the person who built what's inside. I believed, for most of my marriage, that hard work eventually gets recognized, that if you contribute quietly and consistently, credit finds you in the end. I don't fully believe that anymore. I believe, now, that credit has to be documented, dated, and defended, because nobody hands it to you simply because you deserve it. I met Derek Calloway when I was 26, doing contract valuation work for a small manufacturing outfit he'd just inherited a controlling stake in from his uncle, a struggling metal fabrication shop with outdated equipment and 3 unprofitable years running. I was the one who told him, in a report he still keeps framed in his office, that the business was worth saving if he restructured the supply contracts and modernized 2 of the 4 production lines. He asked me to stay on as a consultant. Within 18 months, we were married, and within 3 years, I had personally restructured the company's entire cost model, renegotiated 4 major vendor contracts, and helped secure the loan that funded the new equipment. All of it unpaid. All of it framed, at every family dinner for the next decade, as Derek's turnaround. My family loved that version of the story. My mother, Judith, is the kind of woman who measures a daughter's worth by the size of her husband's title, and my father, Warren, though quieter about it, never once corrected her. My younger sister, Paige, had always been the one who got the compliments growing up. Prettier, louder, the one who filled a room, and somewhere along the way, Naomi. Married well became the family's shorthand for my entire adult life, a sentence that erased 11 years of 80-hour weeks and boardroom presentations, and my own name never once appearing on a single company document, because Derek and his lawyer had decided early on that keeping my role informal was simpler for tax purposes. I let that happen. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the whole point of telling this story. I let it happen because objecting felt petty next to how much I loved the work itself. Paige was the one who called me close most often, in the way a sister does. The one who sent me articles about work-life balance she assumed I needed, who hosted me for wine nights and asked careful, sympathetic questions about my marriage that always seemed to circle back, eventually, to how much Derek was worth these days. I noticed it and moved on, the way you notice a small discrepancy in someone's expense report and decide it's probably an honest mistake. Admiration and envy wear the same face for a long time before you learn to tell them apart. I wish I'd learned sooner, because Paige had been quietly dating one of Derek's junior partners, a man named Colton Reyes, for almost a year before anyone in the family knew. And Colton, it turned out, talked more than he should have. There were other signs too, smaller ones, the kind that only line up once you've laid every entry side by side. My mother had a habit of introducing me at parties as Derek's wife before she ever mentioned my own profession, even though I'd been a licensed appraiser for 6 years before I ever met him. My father, in his quiet way, had started asking me for the family's opinion on things, meaning Derek's, rather than mine, as though the two had become interchangeable the moment we married. I let all of it slide for years, the way you let a rounding error slide, on a small invoice, telling myself it wasn't worth the argument it would take to correct. I told myself that someday, if the pattern ever became undeniable, I would know exactly what to do with it. I just didn't expect that day to arrive over a shirt collar and an oven timer. There was also the matter of the business itself, which I'd watched grow from a struggling three-man fabrication shop into a company with 60 employees and contracts across 4 states, and which I had, at every stage, helped steer, without ever once having my name attached to a filing. When Derek's uncle passed and left him the controlling stake outright, I remember sitting at our kitchen table with him, back when we were still newly married, sketching out a 5-year plan on a legal pad because we couldn't yet afford a proper consultant. I remember him saying, half joking, that he should put me on the board once things stabilized. Things stabilized within 2 years. The board seat never came. I told myself, at the time, that it didn't matter, because I trusted him, and because the money was joint, regardless of the paperwork. I didn't yet understand how much that single omission would end up costing me. What I found in the laundry that Tuesday wasn't really the beginning. It was the last piece of a pattern I'd been circling for months without letting myself name it. I'd noticed over the past year that Derek had started referring to the company's numbers. Never came. I told myself, at the time, that it didn't matter, because I trusted him, and because the money was joint, regardless of the paperwork. I didn't yet understand how much that single omission would end up costing me. What I found in the laundry that Tuesday wasn't really the beginning. It was the last piece of a pattern I'd been circling for months without letting myself name it. I'd noticed over the past year that Derek had started referring to the company's numbers, instead of our numbers, that he'd stopped asking my opinion on vendor renewals I used to draft myself, that a new accountant had appeared on the payroll 6 months earlier without my being consulted, which was strange, because for a decade I had been the company's unofficial accountant in every way that mattered. I found the statement folded into the inside pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner. A wire transfer confirmation, $42,000. Routed to an entity called Meridian Fabrication Holdings, an entity I had never heard of, dated 3 weeks earlier, signed by Derek alone. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him that night over dinner, or the next night, or the night after that. I did what I do for a living. I opened a case file. I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Odom, who I'd worked alongside years earlier on an unrelated valuation dispute, and I told her I wanted a full forensic valuation of Callaway Steelworks, quietly, before Derek knew a single filing existed. My rule, the one I've built an entire career on, is simple. Gather everything before they know you've seen it. People change their behavior the moment they sense they're being watched, and I needed him behaving exactly as he always had. The investigation took 11 weeks, and it was the most methodical work of my professional life, made harder by the fact that I couldn't officially attach my name to any of it. Priscilla brought in an independent appraiser named Frank Delgado to run the formal numbers, while I fed him quietly every piece of institutional knowledge only I possessed. Which vendor contracts were undervalued on paper, which equipment had appreciated rather than depreciated due to a parts shortage nobody outside the plant floor would know about, which client relationships existed entirely because of relationships I had personally built, and never once been credited for. Meridian Fabrication Holdings, it turned out, was a shell entity Derek had quietly incorporated 14 months earlier, and had been using to root a growing share of Callaway Steel's most profitable contracts, the ones I had personally negotiated, so that on paper, ahead of any divorce filing, the parent company's value would look smaller than it actually was. I worked those 11 weeks the same way I'd approach any complex client engagement, building a source binder no one else would ever see. I pulled 5 years of email correspondence I'd sent from my own personal account to vendors, correspondence that existed nowhere in Callaway Steel's official files, but that documented, in my own words and my own timestamps, every renegotiated contract, every supplier relationship I'd personally cultivated, every crisis I'd talked a nervous client through at 11 at night while Derek slept upstairs, unaware the call was even. The messiest trails, and Derek, for all his confidence, had made a rookie mistake. Meridian's registered agent was the same law firm that handled Callaway Steel's regular corporate filings, a detail that took Frank all of 2 days to trace once he knew to look. But the deeper I went into Meridian's formation documents, the stranger things got. The shell company hadn't been Derek's idea at all. The initial filing, dated 14 months earlier, listed a second officer alongside Derek. My own father, Warren Hart. I sat with that discovery for 3 full days before I said anything to anyone. I called Priscilla and she told me, carefully, that whatever this meant, it belonged to a different conversation than the one we were having about the divorce, and she was right. But I couldn't let it go, because it didn't match anything I understood about my father. A man who had spent 30 years as a quiet, risk-averse accountant himself, and had never so much as co-signed a car loan for anyone. The confirmation came from Colton, Paige's boyfriend, who, as it turned out, had helped Derek draft the original Meridian paperwork as a junior associate at the firm, and who broke down over drinks with Paige, guilt finally catching up with him 3 days before Thanksgiving. According to what Paige told me afterward, my father had been quietly investing in Meridian for over a year, using a portion of his retirement account at Derek's invitation, because Derek had told him, falsely, that Callaway Steel was in danger of failing, and that Meridian was a safety net for the family's finances. My father, who had spent a decade watching his wife praise Derek's success as though it were the only success worth measuring in our family, had jumped at the chance to be quietly, secretly essential to it. He hadn't known Meridian was being used to hide value from me. He'd been told it was protecting the family. Nobody had told him. The family he was protecting no longer fully included his daughter's fair share of anything. The person who confirmed all of it, in a way that held up legally, was Frank Delgado, the independent appraiser, whose formal report, delivered to both attorneys the week after Thanksgiving, established in cold professional language that Meridian's assets belonged, in substance if not in form, to Callaway Steel Works, and that my own unrecorded contributions over 11 years, which Frank had painstakingly reconstructed from old emails, meeting notes, and vendor correspondence. I had personally forwarded myself years earlier out of habit, constituted a legitimate documentable claim to a share of the company's actual value, not merely its stated one. The reveal happened at Thanksgiving itself, and I wasn't even in the room for the worst of it, because I'd deliberately stayed in the kitchen that afternoon, letting Priscilla's letter, delivered that morning, to Derek's attorney, and apparently forwarded in a panic to my father, do the work I no longer needed to do myself. Paige told me everything afterward in careful, halting detail, the way you describe an accident you can't stop replaying. She said my mother had been mid-toast, praising Derek's incredible year, when my father set down his glass and said quietly that there was something the family needed to know about Meridian. She said the color left my mother's face in real time as my father explained, haltingly, what he'd invested and why, and that Derek, sitting 2 seats down, had gone completely still. The particular stillness of a man watching a story end before he's ready for it to. Paige said nobody touched their food for almost 10 minutes. She said my mother turned to her at one point and asked, in a small voice nobody in our family had ever heard her use, whether any of what she'd been saying about me all these years had actually been true. Paige said the worst moment came when my mother, still reeling, turned to Derek directly and asked him, in front of everyone, whether it was true that I'd built half of what he owned. She said Derek didn't answer right away, and that the pause itself answered the question more clearly than anything he could have said afterward. My father, Paige told me, looked older in that moment than she'd ever seen him look. Not from the money he'd lost, but from the realization that he'd spent 30 years measuring his daughter's worth by a story that had never once been true. Paige said she left the table before dessert, went out to her car, and called me from the driveway, still in her coat, because she didn't know what else to do with everything she'd just watched happen. Derek came to see me 5 days later, not at the house. I'd changed the locks the week the filing went public, which I was fully entitled to do, but at a coffee shop near my new office at my insistence, on my terms. He looked thinner than I remembered, which I noted the way I'd note any change in a subject's behavior. Information, not sympathy. He apologized for Meridian. He apologized more carefully for a decade of letting my name disappear from documents I had built with my own hands, and said he'd assumed I understood it was just paperwork, that the money was always ours regardless of whose name was on it. I asked him whether he'd ever once considered that my name not being on it was precisely the point, that it meant, at any moment, he could decide it wasn't mine at all. He didn't have an answer for that. He asked, finally, if there was any version of this where we tried again. I told him I understood why he did it. Ambition curdles into justification faster than people expect, and I've seen it in a dozen other men's financial records over the years. Understanding why someone did something, I told him, was not the same as forgiving it, and it was certainly not the same as staying. I said it once, plainly, without raising my voice, and I watched it land on him the way a verdict lands, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something he'd already suspected was true. The settlement took another 5 months, and I made sure it reflected fact rather than spite. Frank's report, entered as evidence, established both Meridian's true value and my documented contribution to Callaway Steel's growth over 11 years, and the final number was substantially higher than anything Derek's original filings had claimed. Higher, in fact, than most of my family had ever imagined the business to be worth in the first place. My father repaid what he could of what he'd invested. I told him, honestly, that I didn't hold him responsible for being lied to, only for never once asking me directly what I actually did for that company all those years. He didn't have an answer for that either, but for the first time in a long while, he looked like he was actually listening. Derek's attorney tried, twice, to argue that my contributions couldn't be formally valued because they'd never been contractually recognized, and both times, Frank's binder of dated correspondence closed that argument before it could go anywhere. There is a particular kind of satisfaction, professional rather than personal, in watching a room full of lawyers realize that the woman they'd been treating as a footnote in someone else's success story had, in fact, been keeping better records than the company's own accounting department. Priscilla told me afterward it was the cleanest settlement negotiation she'd run in years, mostly because there was simply nothing left to argue about once the numbers were on the table. It's been just over a year now. I kept my valuation license, left the informal, unpaid role I'd occupied at Callaway Steel for over a decade, and opened my own firm, one that specializes in exactly the kind of case that unmade my marriage. Forensic business valuation for spouses whose contributions were never put on paper, whose names were quietly left off the documents that mattered. My first client found me through a mutual acquaintance of Priscilla's. I now have a waiting list longer than I have hours in a week. The work looks different from the outside than it feels from the inside. To a new client sitting across from me for the first time, it probably looks like I'm just reading spreadsheets off a laptop. What I'm actually doing is watching the exact moment a woman realizes the years she spent being told she was replaceable were, in fact, thoroughly documented the entire time, even if no one ever bothered to show her the paperwork. I recognize that moment now because I lived it myself, at a kitchen table with a legal pad, back before I understood what any of it would eventually be worth. I keep a small printed copy of Frank's original valuation summary in a frame on my office wall, not the whole report, just the final page, the one with the number on it. Not because the number itself matters anymore, but because it's proof, permanent and dated, that the story my family told about me for over a decade was never the true one. I still keep Frank's original report, the first formal document that ever spelled out, in exact figures, what 11 years of my work had actually been worth, in a drawer in my new office, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of what happens the moment you stop waiting for someone else to notice your value and start proving it yourself. My mother has never apologized directly, not in so many words, but she calls more often now, and she's stopped bringing up Derek's success at family dinners, mostly because there's no longer a version of that story where I'm not the one who built it. Paige and I are still finding our way back to something honest. Colton didn't survive the fallout, professionally or otherwise, and I think some part of Paige is still working out whether she resents me for that or is grateful he finally told the truth. My father calls every Sunday now, just to talk. No agenda, which is new for us, and which I've decided to take at face value rather than interrogate for hidden motives, because not every relationship needs to be forensically examined to be worth having. I hosted my own retirement dinner for my father a few months later, the one that never quite happened the way it should have the first time, since Thanksgiving had swallowed the season whole. I did the cooking myself this time, in my own kitchen, and when my mother asked, almost shyly, if there was anything she could help with, I handed her a stack of napkins and let her set the table, and it felt like the smallest, strangest kind of truce. Not forgiveness exactly, but a willingness on both our parts to start over from an honest starting line instead of the one we'd been standing on for 37 years. My father gave a short toast that night, and instead of thanking Derek for anything, the way he always used to, he thanked me, by name. For the years of work, he said he was only now beginning to understand. I didn't cry. I didn't need to say anything back. I just raised my glass and let it be enough. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's refusing to let anyone else's version of your worth stand in for the number you can actually prove. I think about that Tuesday afternoon often. The iron in my hand, my sister's laugh, the folder already waiting in my car. I think about how easy it would have been to just laugh along, the way I had for years, and let the joke pass like it always had. I wonder, sometimes, what would have happened if I'd never found that wire transfer in the jacket pocket. If Colton had never talked, if my father had simply stayed quiet forever rather than standing up at that table. I'd love to know what you think. Should Naomi ever let her family fully back in? Or has too much already been said around that dinner table? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this story kept you here until the end, hit subscribe. Because there are a lot more women out there whose worth was never written down. And I'm going to keep telling their stories too.